Namaste and welcome to Inspiring Women, produced by Today's Youth Asia. Inspiring Women is an attempt to bring successful women and inspiring stories on women leadership from around the world.
Perhaps I should start with why I'm here in Nepal at the moment. I was in Nepal 2 years ago as the Senior Gender Advisor to the UN Humanitarian Agencies, and I was here for 6 months, 2007 to 8. And this time I'm here, I was invited by CARE Austria and CARE International because this year it's the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which is the first ever resolution about women and women's rights to participation in all aspects of peace processes. And this year, because it's the 10th anniversary, lots of organizations all around the world are taking stock. How far have we come in 10 years? Where next? And the actual anniversary is in October this year, so there'll be a lot of activities, and along with other organizations, CARE internationally are looking, and they're putting together a survey looking at 3 countries, in CARE's case 3 countries, which are Uganda, Afghanistan and Nepal. And I was asked if I would do the survey for Nepal, looking at what's happening on Resolution 1325 here, how far is it being implemented, what next, so that's why I'm here. And I've just spent the last 6 days in some of the poorest communities in the Terai region, various parts of the Terai, and it's been a very interesting experience. We were sort of wading through rivers and riding motorbikes and riding ox carts to get to various communities, to listen to women in some of the poorest women in the poorest communities who have some very interesting opinions.
The 1325 Act has increased the participation of women in decision-making levels in conflict resolution and peace process by appointing them as special representatives and envoys. How is this being implemented in Nepal?
Oh, right. It's not specifically women as special representatives. What it's saying is that in all levels of peace discussions, mediation, peace processes, women should be included as equal partners. And as often there are not enough women in official, formal sectors of society, it makes a big point of including women and men from civil society, from NGOs and other groups as well. In terms of how it's being implemented, did you say here in Nepal or globally? All right, in Nepal. Right now, there's actually a lot going on, there is a national action plan being drawn up. Countries around the world, governments are drawing up national action plans. And the Ministry for Peace and Reconstruction is the lead ministry on this here. There's a group called the Peace Support Working Group 1325, which is the international agencies supporting the ministry doing this. And then the international organizations like CARE and many of the other international organizations, the women's networks like WABDCA and Shanti Malaki and Chagran and lots of the, are all doing various things. But what I was looking at this week was how much women in the grassroots, in the smallest communities, the poorest women, how much were they being involved in the process? What about at district level? And the National Action Plan are part of the process, because it's not just the outcome that's important, it's do people feel involved? If people don't feel involved, it's nothing to do with them. And so as a start, there are going to be 35 participatory meetings around the country in different parts of Nepal, to which at each meeting about 60 people will be invited from the local area, from conflict-affected people, judges, police leaders, political parties, etc. And then there will be, I think, 5 of the meetings will be for girls who were directly affected by the conflict. It's aimed at the areas where there's been the most sort of involved in and impacted on by the conflict. And these are, if I say that for me, the complicated interaction between all these different civil society groups and government groups and international groups makes the Nepali complicated caste system look simple, then you'll understand how very complicated it is to try and follow who's who and who's doing what. But there is a lot going on. I think probably more will need to go on, but the idea is that before October this year, there should be a national action plan that has been produced, which will be the start of how implementing some of the recommendations, because there are quite a few recommendations. If you go on the internet, do you have access to the internet? Can you put up your hands if you have access to the internet? Right, so you all have access to the internet here. If you have access to the internet and you type in 1325, Resolution 1325, you'll find a lot about it internationally. But since then, there have been what I call the daughters of 1325, which are 3 more resolutions that begin with 18, so it's like 18, 20, and 18, 20, I can never remember the numbers. But anyway, these resolutions were particularly addressing the issue of violence against women, protection, prevention, the need for justice for women who experience violence. And I know here there was quite a lot of controversy, wasn't there, that people who committed rape or were responsible might be going to be able to be pardoned and so on. But I think because of the, I hope I'm right in saying accurate, that because of the actions of women here, with support of some of the men here, that has been pushed back now, and that because within the framework of 1325, people can be prosecuted for rape and must be as a war crime. So there is a lot going on here of awareness raising, but because of all sorts of complicated things, etc., there are a number of people who've never heard of 1325 resolution, and I think in the international community as well, there's probably quite a few who haven't. I say well done Youth Asia, today's Youth Asia, because you're a group, you're a very influential group amongst young people, certainly in the valley here. So I hope you'll spread the word. And I hope you'll challenge some of the things, because it's only by having input, you're the future of this country, and by having your input is going to decide the future of this country. It's not people like me coming from Britain or people outside. It's going to be up to you. The future's in your hands.
What measures can we take to improve the condition of women and children in Nepal?
I think by listening and responding to what they're asking for. There was quite an interesting point came up. CARE have been doing, I'm only talking more about CARE now because I'm here with CARE, and I was just come from the field, as I said. I've been looking at other organizations too, and I'll mention that. But one of the partner groups of CARE, one of the community groups, very poor group, had a 20-week training on how women can get their rights within the framework of 1325 resolution, what they're entitled to. How do you make your local authority provide the health service that you're entitled to? How do you get access to it? A lot of people, women, didn't even know that they were entitled to various things. How do you go and get the officials to do what they're responsible for? And one of the things that the women who'd been through this training a while back had done, for example, was they had got on the local forestry committee, and they were sort of running the very local forestry committee. And because they were feeling very empowered, what they said was, now we're feeling empowered, and we're learning how to get our rights. We don't want to be called marginalized women. We don't want to be referred to as though we're poor, poverty, marginalized women. We want to be considered as women and citizens, which is an interesting thought for us all. So we can start by treating people as citizens and women and men, and not perhaps calling them marginalized and poor. But as to what you can do is, I mean, there's a lot of things that came up were about members of the family, in-laws and husbands, who either bully, intimidate, or beat up their partners or members of the family. And I think to speak up against violence, that sort of violence that women, if it's going on in your family, and that's something that definitely can be done, or your neighbours, or to other people, because in some communities it's almost considered normal rights to be able to do that. One woman said to me, and I shall carry her words for a long time, we were driving along to a very remote village, and she said, you know, I was married at 13, and I can't tell you how many times I walked down this road to do the planting in the fields and to look after the fields, crying, because I was so miserable when I first got married, because I didn't know how to cook, and my mother-in-law was bullying me all the time and telling me I was good for nothing. And she said, I walked down this road so many times, just tears coming down my face. So I think, to answer your question, is to make men and women aware that women are equal partners in building this country in the future, and to practice that, not just talk about it, but think about when decisions are being made, and as you move up the ladder, as I'm sure you will in whatever you're doing, to make sure that there's women and men having meaningful participation. My brief for this was not to just look at how many numbers there are. First you get the numbers. You know, there are 33% on the Constituent Assembly, and that's great. That's really important. But then you get people saying, but are they effective? Well, the next stage is how to help them to be effective, set them up for success, help them, how do you work on committees, how do you speak in public, how do male colleagues treat them with respect and not contempt. So that means training the men as well. How do we develop a gender-sensitive parliament or district council or local peace group or committee? How do we make it sure that everything we're doing, we're not being dismissive just because a woman says an opinion, and we don't say, well, yeah, okay, right, and then ignore it. We actually take it into consideration.
Are there any special programs for the developmental of women and girls in a developing country like Nepal?
You said on empowering women or training. Yes, a lot, because you've got so many international organizations here. You've also got a lot of homegrown talent here. The women's movement here was very strong in the initial push for peace. I mean, there's an interesting thing here, and I have a question for you that you might be able to answer, because nobody so far has answered it for me. The women in Nepal, the Nepalese women, were right in the forefront, the women's movements here, in pushing for peace. But the minute that the peace process started, which was formal, etc., they weren't there at all. They were just excluded, and they had to fight to have just one or two women at the formal peace tables. And we see that over and over. It's not just in Nepal. We've seen it with the Middle East talks, hardly any women there, and yet this 1325 resolution exists. We saw it, in country after country. So there is a lot going on. There are many women leaders here. There tends to be at the moment a bit of a division between the men and women in Kathmandu, because you're in a way the privileged lot, because you speak English, many of you, you have access to all the international community and various privileges. Even those who fled to Kathmandu during the conflict are having opportunities now that sisters and brothers out in the countryside may not have. But one of the big questions and big challenges, I think, to all of you is how can you come up with ways, and it might be using new technology, it might be other imaginative ways, of linking much more the communities out there in the villages, district and here, so that it's an equal two-way conversation. There are a lot of good people in Kathmandu who are trying to do good things, but people out there don't just want good things done to them, they want to be part of it. They want their economy to be, they want to be earning enough to eat, not to be worried sick every day about have they got enough clean water, all the basics of life, which is part of a peace process of stabilizing the country. Because otherwise, there's going to be serious problems, I think. Does that answer your question, or do you want to go deeper? I don't know, how long are you going to be here in
Here?
in Nepal?
for 2 more weeks?
I'd strongly recommend you try and find, don't go out on your own because you won't have an entry into into the community. I'd strongly recommend you try and find a way of getting taken out to listen and meet people outside Kathmandu if you haven't already. Have you already?
Women in the village were uneducated and they really didn't have any voice because of a very different cultural background. So what I realized working there was that giving them education is equally important, but also we should give them economic stability. For the empowerment of women, education and economic stability should go hands in hand.
Yes, I mean a lot of the livelihood workshops are going hand in hand with a lot of the empowerment rights. I mean, whether it's groups like Women's Human Rights, which is the single women's organisation for widows and single women here, they're doing empowerment 1325 and livelihoods, care at the same. Most of the international organisations are addressing that. I mean, I agree. There is something that I noticed though, is they tend, and this came from the women themselves in the local villages. When it comes to livelihoods, the international community and other groups tend to assume that because somebody hasn't had a formal education, they haven't got potential. So they tend to be offered hairdressing and sewing, which are very good professions, nothing wrong with it. But they said, some of the women in one of the villages said to me, you know, we know that women can be pilots. We know that women use computers. We can do anything. We're now empowered. We can do anything. But all we need is you to train us to do it. And I think computer skills, I know that a lot of places haven't got electricity, but things will, you know, you've got access to women's centres and so on. Computer skills, repairing motorbikes, driving. I mean, there's so many skills that anyone has. We should stop talking about them and they and look around and say, well, what would we want to do and what opportunities would we like and how can we help people get them?
Unfortunately, today rape is used as one of the most socially destructive weapons of war. Now, I was wondering if you believe laws such as Resolution 1325 can change this, or if the change is going to have to come organically through the societies themselves.
That's probably the toughest question, because there's always been rape in war, we know that. But we are all much more aware of it now, and it is being used systematically, and it's along with other ways of intimidating the community. Often rape in war is used to humiliate the men as much as the women, because the men feel they couldn't protect their family members. And when I'm doing workshops, there's a statement I sometimes give and ask people to discuss it. Why is it that a man who's been wounded in war is considered a hero, but a woman who's been raped in war, at the very least, is considered an embarrassment or a shame to her community? And one of the good things about some of the work I've just been looking at is that women are standing up and saying, yeah, I experienced nasty things in the war, and I'm getting on, you know, and actually coming out, if I can put it in Western terms, coming out and standing up on it. As to prevention, there's a lot of discussion going on about how you prevent these things. I do think raising awareness that it's not socially acceptable. It's not a joke. It's not a funny cartoon or anything like that. It's not. I think that in Egypt, in India, I think they call it teasing, or what's the phrase? That's what? Eve teasing. It's not funny actually. It's a form of bullying. It's rather pathetic in a way. But these things happen. And I do think also the fact that now, with the new resolutions, which are stronger than 1325 on that particular issue, it says it's not just the perpetrator who can be accused of a war crime, but the military commander of the perpetrator or the political leader of the perpetrator. And I think if we start at least to show that you can't get away with it, you know, you're never going to get everybody in the net, but even if we start bringing 1 or 2 to court, I mean, nobody even recognized rape as a war crime until the tribunal of former Yugoslavia, and the first 1 or 2 people were prosecuted then. But it's a tough issue. It's not going to happen overnight. I mean, there are other forms of abuse that sometimes, there are some rituals here that are very cruel to women too, like under Chaupadi, women who've just given birth being in the cowshed for 10 days. There's some very nice traditions here, wonderful traditions, but I think people have to take an honest look at what are the traditions and the attitudes that need to change. But it's a big question. And it's not a question for women, it's a question for men. I'd like to see, you know, it is a men, and we're talking about men and women, what sort of society do we want? So it's you guys that should be thinking about what are the answers, how do we handle it. There's a number of men's networks now working on these issues. It started in Canada, others in Sweden. So I would put it back as a man's responsibility to think about these issues a lot more. Because not all men are rapists by any means, and it brings all men a bad reputation.
How badly is the 10 years of civil war and ongoing chaos in Nepal hampering the already bad situation of women and children in Nepal?
Well, it's an interesting question you've asked about how has the war had a negative effect on women. The war is a nasty thing. I mean, I don't have to tell anyone in Nepal war is a horrid thing. However, often it's after the war and during the war, different opportunities open up. And what we've seen here, particularly for women and roles of women and men, what we've seen here in Nepal is, for example, when men were off in the hills or fighting or whatever, women took over running farms, ploughing, running local communities like community leaders. Some women were combatants on both sides. I don't know if any of you have seen that movie, Sari Soldiers. If not, I recommend it to you. The lives of women on both sides during the conflict. It's a documentary, a Nepali documentary, very good film. So also what it's done is opened up women's and men's awareness of women's human rights here. A lot of this stuff would not have been going on. So oddly enough, although there's been some really damaged lives here, and I've met many men and women who had a terrible time, it's also opened up possibilities. And so it's up to you whether you take them or not.
Thank you for watching us. We look forward to your feedback. Our email address is youthtya@gmail.com. We'll be back next week at the same time. Have a nice week. Namaste.